On the screen in front of you, you can see the planted acreage in green, the production down here in blue, the bars, and the yield in red here. So we can see that even though we haven't necessarily reached the previous planted acreage, our production is increasing and has surpassed previous levels, mostly due to a number of factors, but partly due to this constant increase on the yield of potatoes throughout the years. So good movement for Canada through the production years. Here's a different look at the trendline yields in Canada all the way back to 1987. And again, we can see that constant movement upward all the way up to 332 here in 2023. So we see the constant improvement through such things as best practices in agriculture, soil management, and varietal research. So as we move to varieties with better yields, and we'll talk a little bit about that further on in the presentation. So what were the results? We've talked a little about potatoes overall in Canada over the years and what's happened now in the 2023-24 crop. So I put up the results on the screen. I know there's a lot of numbers up here for you, but overall the planted acreage for the year, the harvested acreage, our yield overall in Canada, and the potato production. So some of those numbers we've talked about. And we can see the impact of the high levels of precipitation that we've gone through the growing season. Overall, 2023 planted very, very well and very quickly. But starting in as early as May and June in the east, the rain started and didn't stop for the most part, especially in Quebec. So we can see that here in the results in terms of potato production versus 2022. But we still had an overall increase of 3.7%. So still very, very good overall. And that's boosted by the increased acreage, of course, in the West, combined with very good yields. So we can see that up to 17% increase in potato production out in the prairie areas. So good production, good crop overall, and this production number is actually a record for the country. So in terms of planted acreage itself, I just wanted to show a 5-year comparison. And again, we can see that increase in the western provinces in Manitoba and Alberta. Most of the other areas have remained fairly flat in terms of overall planted acreage. The increase really has been here. We see it a little bit. It's hard to tell because Saskatchewan is a smaller player in the overall scheme of acreage, but there is some increases going on here in Saskatchewan as well. We expect these figures probably to continue to rise over the next couple of years with the planned expansion of the McCain facility in Coaldale, Alberta, as well as other developments in processing throughout North America. But this probably will stabilize after a couple of years unless we see even more investment in plant expansions or additions. But we'll see. There's a lot going on at the moment in North America. There's some potential for seed acres to increase. However, fresh acres will likely remain stable. So Canadian harvested acreage. So this tells a little bit of a different story. We still see this impact here of the cool and rainy growing season on harvested acres in eastern Canada. There were a lot of low-lying areas that were left in the field to try and avoid storage issues. And there were others that lost fields early on in washouts in June in areas of Quebec, for example. Most regions did get a good 2 to 3 weeks of good weather at harvest. Other than PEI, Mark can attest to that. There was nothing but rain at harvest, but for the most part, the other provinces helped recover some of what could have been a really bad crop. Abandoned acres, as you can see down near the bottom, is around 10,000 acres. It is almost double last year, but with the increase in planted acres, it still represents only 2.5% of the total planted acreage. And there are some notable differences in terms of regions. In the 2022 crops, there were more lost acres in the West due to very wet and cold spring and near drought conditions in Alberta. But this year, the heavy rains hit Ontario, PEI, New Brunswick, and particularly Quebec, where we saw the largest abandonment numbers for 2023. The other losses would be in Alberta and Manitoba out of the processing crop due to high yields. There was some, issues with availability of storage. There were over-contracted processing potatoes we'll talk about a little bit later, as well as some damage from hailstorms earlier on in the growing season. So Canadian potato production, moving on to the production part of it. Again, we talked about the overall number. It is a record looking back through history. I've just given you back to 2020, but and 2020, of course, COVID, there was an impact there, but it is record production. We're still 3.7% over last year. It's an indication of a good growing season for most provinces, and of course the improved yields over 2022 that I mentioned earlier. Again, we see that impact here in the east of that really rainy growing season, impacting what was actually brought out of the ground and what was lost early on. But you can also see that 17% over last year, even with some of those processing acres abandoned due to over-contracted. So very good overall, and brought the numbers up to almost 4% increase over last year. And I just wanted to show a little bit to production over the last 20 years. And this is sort of an east-west comparison. You can see I've just lumped the Western provinces together in purple. Ontario and Quebec, we left out central in the gray, and then you see the maritime provinces, dominated mostly by PEI, but of course New Brunswick as well. But you can see that proportion changing over the years in terms of what the Western provinces are really increasing in terms of potato production. Again, mostly focused in the processing sector, particularly Alberta, which stems from that continued global demand for frozen fries. It doesn't seem to be decreasing at the moment or anytime soon. So we can see that reflected in our own potato production in Canada. And just talking about the different sectors, I know Mark in his presentation later on will talk a little bit more about how the sectors are divided up in Canada. But for the fresh sector, we estimate approximately 89,000 acres are planted in Canada for the fresh sector. And this, the production would be about 49,000 hundredweight. So it is important this year, though, also to keep an eye on the availability of number twos. Out of the season that we've had, there have been some marketing strategies as well employed to use these lower grade potatoes in promos. So it is an interesting thing that's come out of the production this year. There is definitely a surplus in the US, in russets in particular. The prices have dropped significantly in the US, but are holding so far better in Canada. We are monitoring surplus potatoes from the processing sector. We don't want to see them dumped into the fresh sector. So we do keep an eye on that and, talk with our US counterparts to see what's happening with those potatoes. Idaho has been working hard to recoup market share that they lost after nearly 2 years of real shortages, particularly in russets. So we've seen a lot of marketing happening. They always do anyway, but even more so this year, and some very aggressive pricing since September. We've started to see the impact of the surplus and the low prices from the Pacific Northwest in a drop of Canadian exports, most definitely. As of January, Canadians' fresh potato exports overall were 12.8% lower than last year. And the exports to the USA, which makes up the bulk of that, were 13.4% lower at the same time last year. It is important to note, though, that those 47,874 tons of potatoes moving to the US is still 755 tons more than 2021. So it does sound like doom and gloom, but it is still a significant portion of the potatoes. But there is an impact on that fresh sector in terms of our exports. The processing sector, so that would be including the transformation of potatoes to potato chips as well as frozen. So we estimate around 197,000 acres for frozen and 43,200 acres for potato chips planted in Canada in 2023. We do see, like Ontario, for example, is a very big chip market. And their crop was very good yields this year. So things are going well in terms of supply for potato chips in that market. Quebec, however, on processing is tight, so we'll see how that's going to go moving forward. The excess russets we talked about in the Pacific Northwest does include Alberta and Manitoba. So there were too many acres contracted because of the last 2 years of shortages. There were a lot of nervous people and the over contracting because of the expansion that's planned. So there's expansion in Idaho, the Lamb Weston plant in American Falls, the Simplot plant in Moses Lake, Washington, the Kraft Heinz plant, which had been taken over by Simplot in Oregon, the McCain Coaldale plant in Alberta. All of that was planned, so they knew it was coming. However, the earliest is the Idaho plant in spring of 2024, which really probably isn't soon enough to take a lot of this surplus, excuse me. So we'll see how that goes. In Eastern Canada, different story. We've seen some quality issues with the russets in Eastern Canada and definitely in Maine, some hollow heart issues in certain of the varieties, not all of the russet varieties, but that's due to that abundant rainfall. And there also have been some reports of low gravity. So they tried to avoid that and tried to avoid that storage issues, but it's still coming through a little bit. The global demand for fries continues unabated. So as we've talked about, we're still seeing that expansion in processing. And overall contract negotiations are underway in the Columbia Basin, which is normally the area that starts off those negotiations, and some initial meetings have started to take place in Canada. In terms of the seed sector, good seed crops in the west, Saskatchewan, BC, big areas for seed, Alberta as well. They've been able to manage, despite those hot, dry temperatures, have done very well in terms of the location further north of some of those seed crops. So they've done fairly well. In the east, is not bad. They've managed some of that precipitation. The Quebec crop, for example, is farther north, but not quite as good as we would see in the west. Fewer acres under contract in processing. That is the talk, that they will be reducing their contracted acreage based on what happened this year. And we'll see how that impacts the planting intentions in 2024. We want to make sure that we keep our seed growers in business. None of us can really continue without them. So we want to keep going and talking with them and giving them the right information so that we have a robust seed industry going forward. We do continue to see this trend from red to yellow. I kind of touched on that earlier. Varieties, that does continue. So that does have the effect, of course, of improving the yields. The yellows tend to have better yields, and so keeping the increase in production as well, even though acreage overall may stay stable, but the switch of varieties does give a boost to the production. In other, seed sector is facing the same high production costs as the other sectors. So they're experiencing the same issues. So we have to keep an eye on that in terms of, like I said, keeping a robust seed sector moving forward. Our current holdings, so where are we now as of January? We've talked about the crop overall and the production. This is just a chart showing you the, sorry, I'm just going to move this on my screen. The production stocks at January in millions of tons. This is sometimes how it's reported globally. At the beginning of the month, there were a record 3.8 million tons of potatoes in storage in the country, according to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, which is up 7.2% over the same point last year. Usage to the beginning of January, 13.3% more than the year before, but seasonal usage of all time, this all-time largest crop, is actually 2.5% less at 1.9 million tons. So we are seeing a bit of a slowdown in the pace of movement. So with the surplus, people, are keeping an eye on that, making sure things are going to keep moving. We have seen a shift westwards in production, with stocks in the Eastern Maritime region are down 13%, but the Prairie region are up 28.4%. And that, fits in with what we've seen in terms of the overall crop and the production of where it's being stored in Canada. Although storages are at record levels, if we continue the current pace of movement in the fresh sector itself, we could have those stocks cleaned up in just shy of 6 months' time. It's more the concern over the high level, of course, of processing potatoes, which we've talked about, and that will probably fall through into the planting intentions for 2024. It is important to note too, with this cold snap, I'm sure you've all felt this cold snap that we've been experiencing. So the quality in storage changes with those temperature changes as well, with that frigid cold weather. Storages remain closed for longer times, and so CO2 levels can build up. So growers are going to be keeping a very close eye on their piles as we move forward. The cold weather also can affect the movement of crops, because it's not great for potatoes to move in very, very cold weather. And the equipment is even having a hard time keeping that refrigerated temperature stable. So that's a look at the overall Canadian market and where we're at. But in order to really look at the North American market as a whole, we should, of course, look at the US production. USDA puts the national average yield at 452 hundredweight per acre, which is 15 over last year. And just as reference, in Canada, we're at 332. And you can see some of these high yields in the Columbia Basin, Oregon and Washington. California is smaller in terms of overall production, but big yields, and Idaho returning to more trendline yields this year. So that certainly had an impact on the overall production, which, as you can see here, at 434, 220,000 hundredweight. That's a lot of potatoes. And if you look at Idaho alone, they actually have production greater than in Canada across the entire country. So just to keep the scale in mind of the number of potatoes that are out there. And of course, Washington here following very close behind. So that Pacific Northwest, with a focus on processing and russets, is where we see some of that surplus. Based on the estimates, and these estimates down below from USDA, this is actually the largest potato crop since the year 2000. 9 out of the 13 reporting states actually showed increases this year. So there are definitely a lot of potatoes out there. In terms of US supply, largest potato crop since 2000. Idaho increased 21 million hundredweight over the 2022 crop. It is important to note, however, that Idaho did reduce their planted acres by 25,000 last year. So the increase of 35,000 this year, there is a difference there of that about 10,000, which, a lot was around. That's actually the estimated amount necessary for this expansion in American Falls. So we can see some of the mindset behind it. Perhaps the timing was a little off. So the russet table potato supplies, of course, will be plentiful. We also want to make sure that we don't see too much of the processing russets falling into that fresh market. Red potato supplies are actually a little bit tighter this season, and that's due to this change of red to yellow varieties, and just the yields and production that are coming out. And they've been moving very, very well. The shipment pace in the US and even in Canada of red potatoes has been very good. Yellow potato supplies, as we mentioned, continue to rise, linked to that change of variety. And of course, the frozen processors and dehydrators should have more than enough raw product to supply capacity. Moving out of North America, I just wanted to give you a quick update on the European market. So very challenging supply scenario, unprecedented rainfall and flooding. Just their harvest was one of the most difficult on record. They're saying now that in Belgium and the Netherlands, there's probably over 1 million hundredweight of potatoes left in the ground. So they've had a really tough go on it. And we're seeing that, of course, in some of the price increases. Ukraine in particular continues to rise. They were already having good demand and prices were going up, but they've also indicated a high percentage of substandard product in this season and not suitable for long-term storage. So I think now that they've had their cold temperatures hit, we're starting to see that impact on storage, and that's why we're seeing that continuation of the price increases there. Canada, the US may be able to take some market share from European processors. So we're going to see the tide turn. We've had a lot of imports of frozen product from Europe into North America. That tide may turn now with their potential supply issues. It will depend, of course, on our processors' capacity to have that product ready and out for export. Overall, the story in Europe is short supply, rising prices, and lower exports. And there are some potential seed shortages going along with that for the same weather-related reasons. So what does it mean? I know it's great to talk about the facts and figures, but what does it mean for you as growers? And I know people are interested in that. Of course, we have this plentiful supply of North American potatoes, tight supply of processing potatoes in eastern parts of eastern Canada. So there may be some potential for oversupply in the west to move east. I think a little bit of that's happened, and so we'll see how that continues. Potential to take the export of processed product to Europe. Hopefully our exchange rate, I mean, I know it's not happy to say we don't have a strong dollar, but sometimes that keeps our offers attractive on the global market. Certain inputs like cost, like fertilizer and fuel have stabilized, but they're still way above 2021 levels. So it's still a costly crop. So we're keeping an eye on that. Exports to the US, we talked about that, are seeing declines. Midwestern and eastern states, as well as provinces, are working hard to keep the red-yellow pricing at a good value and try to de-link it from this in the minds of some of the buyers with the russet decline that we've seen. So overall, we'll keep an eye on movement of potatoes, not just in the shipment of fresh potatoes, but also the shift in potatoes between sectors. I think I'm still okay for a couple minutes, and then we'll take some questions. Just some opportunities to talk about technology improvements, optical sorters, software to control irrigation, use of drones, etc. Best practices in regenerative agriculture, cover crops, crop rotation, soil management strategies are being shared. I think that's the most important part, is that there's so much out there and talk about it, and it's being shared across the country, those best practices, which is really important. We continue the varietal research, both within the industry, at university levels, government funding for that, looking for varieties that are resistant to disease, climate change, even smoke. Forest fires have impact, the research on the smoke impacting potato growth. So there's a lot going on there, which is really important. The global demand for processing continues to grow, and precision agriculture also, with all these input costs going up. What do we do to combat that? Well, our ability to practice precision agriculture, conserving crop applications, conserving water, and other resources. So that there are a lot of opportunities, and it's a good thing. Some challenges. We've talked a lot about this. The only one I wanted to mention is the possibility of restrictions on crop applications. There's not anything out there here in Canada. I don't want to raise any alarms, but we always keep an eye on what's going on in Europe. So CIPC, for example, in Europe has already been restricted. And most recently, I was reading an article that Great Britain is looking at the withdrawal of the approval for mancozeb, which is particularly crucial in the control of potato blight. So it's something that we always want to keep an eye on what's happening in Europe and how long will it take to come to North America, if it does. Water supply, not a problem for all regions, but it is for certain regions. And with drought conditions continuing in the west, lower levels of snowpack, we want to keep an eye on that. Availability and cost of storage of potatoes, particularly in the west, when you have this bigger supply of potatoes, we need to be able to put them somewhere. And what is the cost of it? And if we want to expand, the land cost and availability of land. And just along that lines, if there isn't a succession plan in place for some of the growers don't have that succession in place, and somebody comes along and says, I want to use your fields for solar panel use and puts a very attractive offer, well, we need to make sure that our farmers are staying farmers and that we support them to keep farming the land rather than using it for other uses. So that's some of the challenges. Just to wrap up, I would like also to take a chance to thank our valued sponsors. We're, as a nonprofit, we rely on the generosity of our industry partners to help us carry out our activities and events. And you can see a lot of them on screen across Canada. And we're super excited to announce our first national level sponsor. Volm Companies Canada has joined on as our first national level sponsor. So we're very excited about that. Thank you very much. Hopefully haven't gone too much over time, and we can leave it open for some questions.
Thank you very much for that Victoria. And yes, we do have a few questions that have popped up in the Q&A here.
Okay.
One of the first ones, we have time for maybe one or two, depending on how long your answers are. One of the questions is, why is the industry shifting to more yellow varieties as opposed to red?
And that's a question I've been asking actually for the last year or so. And there are a few different answers. One is the consumer demand, as yellows have entered the market. There was a period of, I think in about 2016, where there was a serious shortage of red potatoes for weather-related and crop-related reasons. And so yellows were substituted into the market, and the consumers ate them up, literally, and really enjoyed that. So, and the growers have seen that the yields are very good on the yellows as well. So there has been that trend to move that over.
Perfect. And I think we got time for one more here. It's one question. The 1987 to 2023 yield trend line is excellent info. I assume that's including dryland acres. Would it be possible to see that data with irrigated acres only?
Very good question. I will take note. I don't have that right now. It's one of the things that we've actually been discussing in terms of improvement of data collection, of breaking our planted acreage, for example, down to category red, russet, yellow, whites, doing things like irrigated versus dry land, because every province is different and every area is different and how that's impacting the yield. So unfortunately, I don't have that answer for you right now, but I will take note that there is definitely, I thought there was interest in this, so I'm glad to have that confirmed.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Victoria. And there is one other question in the Q&A. So if you do stick around, you're more than welcome to take a look in there, and you can answer it by typing out if you have the time.
I will definitely do that. Thank you so much.